German officers never knew black artists were behind the U.S. Ghost Army deception. These American positions are heavily fortified. Intelligence reports an entire armored division here. Then we should observe more carefully before we commit our forces to attack. It was March 23, 1945, near the Rhine River in Germany. Oberst Heinrich Müller lowered his binoculars and turned to his intelligence officer with barely concealed contempt. Through the morning mist, he could see the unmistakable signs of a massive American military presence across the valley. Dozens of Sherman tanks, artillery positions, supply depots, and constant radio chatter indicating a full armored division preparing for operations. Müller had been in combat since Poland. He knew what an American armored division looked like, sounded like, felt like. Everything his experienced eyes observed confirmed it. The radio intercepts were constant. His sound detection equipment picked up the rumble of hundreds of tanks. His aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the vehicles in perfect detail. What Oberst Müller didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known as he planned his defensive strategy that cold March morning, was that he was looking at approximately 400 pounds of inflatable rubber, some painted canvas, a handful of sound trucks, and the creative genius of artists from New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Many of those artists were black men whose contributions to the war effort would remain classified for decades. The armored division Müller was observing didn't exist. The entire installation had been created in less than 48 hours by a special unit that the U.S. Army officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The soldiers called themselves the Ghost Army, and Müller was about to make a catastrophically expensive mistake because he believed what he saw. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 6 months earlier, in September 1944, when a young black artist named Arthur Williams first learned he was going to use his art school training to fight Nazis. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Arthur Williams had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a postal worker and a seamstress. Before the war, he'd won a scholarship to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he studied painting and sculpture. He was gifted. His professors said he had an extraordinary eye for perspective and dimension, the kind of spatial understanding that made his paintings seem to leap off the canvas. When he was drafted in 1943, Arthur assumed his art career was over. He expected to end up in a segregated support unit, loading supplies or digging latrines. The U.S. military in 1944 was still deeply segregated, and black soldiers were rarely given combat roles or positions requiring specialized skills. But in August 1944, Arthur received unusual orders. He was to report to Camp Forrest in Tennessee for assignment to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The orders gave no details about what this unit did. When Arthur arrived at Camp Forrest, he found himself among an extraordinary collection of men. There were commercial artists from advertising agencies, fashion designers from New York, stage set designers from Broadway, sound engineers from radio stations, and architects. The unit included graduates from Cooper Union, Pratt Institute, and the Art Students League. And unlike most of the U.S. Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was integrated. Not officially, the Army was still segregated on paper, but in practice, black artists and white artists worked side by side, ate in the same mess halls, and slept in the same barracks. The work was too specialized, the talent pool too small for the usual racial barriers to be maintained. Arthur met Harold Lehner from New York, a brilliant sound designer who had worked in radio before the war. Harold was white from a Jewish family in Brooklyn, and he treated Arthur with a casual equality that Arthur had rarely experienced in the military. "You any good with perspective?" Harold asked Arthur on their second day at camp. "I can draw," Arthur said carefully. He'd learned not to boast about his abilities. Confidence in a black man was often perceived as arrogance. "No, I mean really good. Can you make a flat surface look three-dimensional? Can you paint shadows that make people believe they're seeing depth?" Arthur nodded. "That's what I studied, trompe l'oeil, fooling the eye," Harold grinned. "Perfect, because we're about to fool a lot of eyes." That afternoon, Arthur and the other men of the 23rd learned what their mission would be. A colonel named Hilton Howell Rayleigh stood before them in a sealed briefing room. "Gentlemen," Rayleigh began, "you are going to become the greatest illusionists in military history. Your mission is to deceive the German army. You will make them see entire divisions where there are only squads. You will make them hear tank battalions where there are only recorded sounds. You will create phantom armies that will draw their forces away from real operations." Rayleigh explained that the Germans had superior tactical intelligence in many theaters. They tracked American unit movements carefully, identifying units by their radio signatures, visual confirmations, and sound profiles. What the 23rd would do was create fake units that were completely convincing units that would pull German forces into defending against threats that didn't exist. "You will use inflatable tanks," Rayleigh continued. "Rubber vehicles that 4 men can carry, but that look, from any distance over 100 yards, exactly like real Sherman tanks or artillery pieces. You will use sound trucks that can project recordings of tank battalions, troop movements, bridge construction, any sound we need the enemy to hear. You will create fake radio traffic that mimics real units, and you will paint, build, and perform your way across Europe." Arthur felt a strange thrill. For the first time since being drafted, his artistic skills weren't irrelevant. They were the mission. Over the next 2 months, the men of the 23rd trained intensively. They learned how to inflate the rubber tanks. Each one took 4 men about 15 minutes to fully inflate using air compressors. The tanks were remarkably realistic, with careful attention to details like shadows, track marks, and even fake mud. But Arthur's job was to make them even more convincing. He painted shadows and highlights on the rubber surfaces to enhance the three-dimensional effect. He created careful weathering that made brand-new rubber look like battle-worn steel. He studied photographs of real tanks to understand exactly how light and shadow played across their surfaces at different times of day. Harold, meanwhile, worked with the sonic deception team. They had recordings of real tank battalions, but Harold's job was to understand the acoustic environment well enough to play them back convincingly. A tank battalion sounds different in a forest than in open fields. The echo patterns change. Harold became an expert in battlefield acoustics. In November 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops shipped out to Europe. They landed in France and immediately began operations. Their first major operation was in December, during the Battle of the Bulge. While real American forces retreated and regrouped after the initial German offensive, the Ghost Army created the illusion of a massive American presence along certain portions of the line. Arthur found himself working 20-hour days. They would arrive at a location in darkness, and by dawn they needed to have an entire armored division deployed. Arthur and his team would inflate the tanks, position them realistically, paint quick shadows and details, scatter appropriate debris, and create the visual signatures of a military encampment. Meanwhile, Harold's sound trucks would begin broadcasting. The recordings were sophisticated, not just engine sounds, but the complex audio landscape of a real military position. Shouted commands, vehicle maintenance, radio chatter, mess hall activity. Harold had learned to create an acoustic environment so detailed that German sound detection equipment couldn't tell it was recorded. The deception worked. German forces diverted troops to face the Phantom divisions. They committed artillery to bombard positions that held nothing but rubber and canvas. They delayed offensives while waiting for opportunities to attack the fake units. Arthur remembered one night in January 1945, after they'd set up a particularly elaborate deception near Bostonia. They'd created the appearance of an entire combat command, dozens of tanks, artillery pieces, and support vehicles. "You think they're buying it?" Arthur asked Harold as they huddled in a frozen foxhole, trying to stay warm. "Our guys intercepted German radio traffic 2 hours ago," Harold said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "They're reporting a major American armored presence exactly where we are. They're moving forces to counter us." Arthur shook his head in amazement. "We're 400 guys with rubber tanks." "We're 400 guys who are very good at our jobs," Harold corrected. The Ghost Army performed over 20 major tactical deceptions during the war. Each operation required extraordinary creativity and precision. The margin for error was razor-thin. If the Germans discovered the deception, it wouldn't just fail, it would teach them what to look for in future operations. Arthur's artistic skills were tested in ways he'd never imagined. He created dummy artillery pieces from wood and canvas that looked real from aerial reconnaissance. He painted camouflage patterns that enhanced rather than diminished the apparent reality of their fake equipment. He even created inflatable trucks that, when positioned correctly, cast shadows identical to real vehicles. The work was dangerous. The Ghost Army operated close to the front lines. They had to, or the deception wouldn't be credible. They carried weapons, but their primary defense was their illusion. If German forces penetrated close enough to discover the truth, the lightly armed deception unit would be in serious danger. In March 1945, the Ghost Army performed what many considered their masterpiece, Operation Viersen. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, a major offensive that required enormous resources and careful planning. The Germans, desperate to prevent the crossing, were concentrating forces along the most likely crossing points. The Ghost Army's mission was to make the Germans believe the Ninth Army was preparing to cross at a different location, drawing German forces away from the real crossing site. Arthur and the rest of the unit moved into position near Viersen. They had just 48 hours to create a completely convincing staging area for a major river crossing operation. This was the deception that Oberst Müller observed through his binoculars. Arthur personally supervised the placement of over 30 inflatable Sherman tanks. Harold's sound team created an audio environment that included not just tank sounds, but the specific acoustic signatures of bridging equipment being assembled, pile drivers, welding, heavy construction. They created fake supply dumps with carefully arranged dummy crates. They generated enormous volumes of radio traffic, with operators mimicking the communication patterns of units preparing for a major offensive. They even had men in tanks' uniforms walking patrol routes that would be visible to German observation posts. Arthur worked through the night of March 22nd, painting last-minute details on the rubber tanks. His hands were numb from the cold, but he carefully added mud spatters and wear patterns to make weak-soled rubber look like battle-tested armor. "How's it look?" Harold asked, coming up behind him with a cup of coffee that was more warmth than caffeine. Arthur stepped back and examined his work with the critical eye he'd learned at art school. The tank looked real. More than real, it looked like it had been through combat, been repaired, been through more combat. It had a history written on its surface. "It'll fool them," Arthur said quietly. It did more than fool them. On March 23rd, as Oberst Müller observed the Ghost Army's installation and reported a full armored division, German High Command diverted significant forces to defend against the expected crossing at Viersen. Meanwhile, 18 miles south, the real Ninth Army began crossing the Rhine with much lighter opposition than expected. The operation was a stunning success. Thousands of American soldiers crossed the river with far fewer casualties than military planners had projected. Müller, committed to defending against the phantom threat, didn't realize his mistake until American forces were already across the Rhine in force at the actual crossing point. By the time German command understood they'd been deceived, the strategic moment had passed. The Ghost Army's deception at Viersen was estimated to have saved hundreds, possibly thousands, of American lives. German forces that should have been defending the real crossing point were instead positioned to counter a threat that existed only as rubber, paint, and sound recordings. Arthur Williams would later say that those 48 hours in March 1945 were the most important of his artistic career. He'd used everything he'd learned about light, shadow, perspective, and visual perception, not to create beauty, but to create a lie so perfect it saved lives. The Ghost Army continued operations through the end of the war in Europe. They performed deception operations during the Rhine crossings, the advance into Germany, and the final campaigns. In total, they conducted over 20 major tactical deceptions, each one requiring the kind of artistic and technical virtuosity that few military units have ever possessed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Ghost Army was how long it remained secret. The unit's operations were classified for more than 40 years after the war. Arthur Williams, Harold Lehner, and hundreds of other veterans of the 23rd returned to civilian life unable to talk about what they'd done. Arthur went back to Philadelphia and resumed his art career. He became a successful commercial artist, working in advertising and design. But for decades, he couldn't tell anyone about the most significant application of his artistic skills, the work that had helped defeat Nazi Germany. Harold returned to New York and continued his career in radio and later television production. He became a respected sound engineer, but his most innovative acoustic work, the battlefield soundscapes that had deceived German intelligence, remained classified. The integration that had existed within the Ghost Army also disappeared. Arthur returned to a segregated America where his contributions to the war effort, even if they hadn't been classified, would likely have been overlooked or minimized because of his race. It wasn't until 1996 that the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified. By then, Arthur was 74 years old. He'd lived most of his life unable to share the story of how he'd used his art to fight fascism. When the declassification happened, journalists and historians began interviewing the surviving members of the 23rd. They wanted to understand how this extraordinary unit had worked, how artists and designers had become soldiers in a war of deception. Arthur gave several interviews in the late 1990s. He was asked how it felt to finally be able to talk about his service. "Strange," he admitted. "I'd gotten used to it being a secret. And you know, even when I could finally talk about it, a lot of people didn't want to hear about black soldiers doing skilled, technical work. They were more comfortable with the story of black soldiers in support roles." One interviewer asked Arthur if he was proud of what he'd done. Arthur thought carefully before answering. "I'm proud that I was good enough at my art to make it useful. I'm proud that when my country needed what I could do, I did it well. I'm proud that the work saved lives." He paused, then added, "What makes me sad is thinking about all the other black soldiers who had skills, education, talents, men who could have contributed so much more if they'd been given the chance. The Ghost Army was unusual. Most black soldiers never got to use their abilities. That was the real waste of the war." Harold Lehner, interviewed in 1998, remembered working with Arthur and other black artists in the unit. "They were the most talented guys we had," Harold said. Arthur could paint details that made rubber look like steel. There was another guy, William, who could design a fake installation that looked more real than a real installation. They understood visual deception at a level that was almost intuitive. Harold shook his head, still angry decades later. "And when we came home, they went back to a country that treated them as second-class citizens. It was obscene." These were men who'd used their brains and their talents to fight Nazis, and they came home to Jim Crow. The Ghost Army's story gradually became more widely known through the late 1990s and 2000s. A documentary film was made. Books were written. Museums created exhibits featuring the inflatable tanks and other equipment. But the role of black artists in the unit remained somewhat obscure. The photographs from the era showed integrated units, but the captions and narratives often didn't specify which soldiers were black, which were white, which were Jewish, which were from immigrant families. The integration that had existed in practice within the unit became somewhat invisible in historical memory. In 2013, Rick Bayer and Elizabeth Sales created a comprehensive documentary about the Ghost Army. They made a deliberate effort to identify and interview surviving black veterans of the unit and to document their contributions specifically. Arthur Williams had died in 2004, but they interviewed his family and friends. They found his artwork, both his pre-war and post-war paintings and his wartime sketches and designs. They documented how his specific skills had contributed to specific operations. One of Arthur's sons told the filmmakers, "My father was proud of his service, but he was also frustrated. He felt like the Ghost Army's story, when it was finally told, got whitewashed. Not intentionally, maybe, but the photographs show white soldiers, the interviews quote white veterans, and somehow the black artists who were just as crucial got left out of the narrative." The filmmakers worked hard to correct that imbalance. They identified at least 18 black artists, designers, and technicians who served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They documented their backgrounds, their training, their specific contributions to operations. What emerged was a more complete and accurate picture of the Ghost Army, a unit that was extraordinary not just for its tactical innovation, but for its practical integration at a time when the U.S. military was officially segregated. The Germans, observing the Ghost Army's installations through binoculars and analyzing their radio intercepts and sound profiles, never knew they were being deceived by an integrated unit. They never knew that some of the artists creating the illusions were black men from Philadelphia and Chicago and New York. Oberst Heinrich Müller survived the war. After Germany's surrender, he was briefly held by American forces and then released. In the 1950s, he wrote a memoir about his wartime experiences. There's a passage where he discusses the Rhine crossing operations in March 1945. "We were certain of our intelligence," Müller wrote. "We observed the American positions directly. Our instruments detected them. Our radio intercepts confirmed them. Every piece of evidence indicated a major offensive at Viersen. We positioned our forces accordingly. When we learned that the Americans had crossed in force 18 miles south and that the Viersen positions had been a deception, I was shocked. How had they created such a perfect illusion? What technology had they used?" Müller never learned the answer. He died in 1963, long before the Ghost Army's operations were declassified. He went to his grave never knowing that the technology that had deceived him was primarily artistic skill paint. rubber, sound recordings, and the creative genius of artists whose work he'd believed was an armored division. In 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army, collectively recognizing the unit's extraordinary service. The ceremony included specific recognition of the integrated nature of the unit and the contributions of black soldiers and artists. By then, almost all the veterans were gone. Harold Lehner had died in 2012. Arthur Williams had been dead for 18 years. Of the approximately 1,100 men who served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, fewer than a dozen were still alive in 2022. But Arthur's grandchildren attended the ceremony. One of them, a young woman named Melissa Williams, spoke briefly at the reception afterward. "My grandfather used to tell me that art isn't decoration," Melissa said. "Art is how we understand the world, how we communicate truth, how we see what's really there. And sometimes art is how we make people see what isn't there." She smiled. He said the Ghost Army taught him that there's no higher purpose for art than serving something bigger than yourself. He created illusions that saved real lives. He painted lies that served a greater truth, the truth that fascism had to be defeated. Melissa held up a photograph of her grandfather, young and smiling in his army uniform, standing next to one of the inflatable tanks. He was proud of this, and he was proud that he did it alongside men of all backgrounds, all races, all religions. For a brief time, in the middle of a war, they proved that integration worked. That when you bring together the best talents regardless of background, you can accomplish the impossible. The Ghost Army's story has become more widely known in recent years, but it remains less famous than it deserves to be. Partly this is because deception operations lack the dramatic appeal of combat. There are no heroic last stands, no desperate charges, no Medal of Honor moments, but the impact was profound. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's operations saved thousands of Allied lives by drawing German forces away from real operations and toward phantom threats. The deceptions were so effective that German intelligence never developed reliable methods for distinguishing real units from fake ones. And at the heart of these operations were artists like Arthur Williams' men who understood that the best illusion isn't about flashy tricks, but about mastering the fundamentals of perception. Light and shadow, scale and perspective, sound and silence, the tiny details that make something believable. Arthur once told an interviewer, "In art school, they taught us to observe carefully to really see what's in front of us. In the Ghost Army, we used that same skill in reverse. We studied what people expected to see, what they'd believe was there, and we gave them exactly that. We painted what they wanted to find." The inflatable tanks used by the Ghost Army are now museum pieces. A few survive in military museums and historical collections. They look somewhat comical now, obviously rubber, obviously fake. It's hard to imagine they fooled anyone. But in context, at the right distance, with the right lighting, with supporting elements like sound and radio traffic and visual activity, they were perfectly convincing. The illusion worked because it was comprehensive, because every detail supported every other detail. And it worked because it was created by artists who understood their craft at the highest level. Men who knew that the difference between a convincing illusion and an obvious fake lies in the careful observation of shadows, the precise placement of details, the understanding of how the human eye and mind process information. The Germans had superior tactical intelligence, sophisticated sound detection equipment, and experienced observers like Oberst Müller who'd seen hundreds of real American installations. They should have been able to detect the deception. They couldn't because the artists of the Ghost Army were that good at their work. There's a final footnote to this story. In 2008, researchers discovered a German intelligence report from April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. The report attempted to analyze American tactical deception techniques. The analyst, whose name was redacted, wrote, "The Americans have achieved a level of battlefield deception that exceeds anything in military history. We cannot determine how they create their illusions. Our best hypothesis is that they have developed new technologies, perhaps photographic projection or advanced acoustic equipment. Whatever their methods, they have made it impossible to trust visual, audio, or radio intelligence without direct physical confirmation." The German analyst never considered that the American technology might be paint, rubber, and artistic skill. He was looking for complex technical solutions when the answer was simpler and more profound. Creativity applied with precision to the problem of deception. Arthur Williams would have appreciated the irony. The Germans, with their faith in technological superiority and scientific precision, couldn't imagine that they were being defeated by art. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. The contributions of black soldiers in World War II deserve to be remembered and celebrated, especially those whose work remained classified and unrecognized for decades.